Hello, dear students. This is the second practical work of the discipline Hygienic Certification of Workplaces for students of the educational program 6B 11201 Life Safety and Environmental Protection. The topic of the second practical work is called Determining the Severity of the Labor Process. This presentation was prepared by assistant of my Aerology and Labor Protection Department, Isakov Bigjan Yerbulatovich. The purpose of the work: training in practical skills to determine the severity of the labor process. Lessons plan: introduction to the theoretical part of the material, the procedure for performing the work, task for practical work. Let's start with the main idea of the work. The set of elements of the labor process determines the nature of the labor load on various physiological systems of the worker. The main characteristic of the workload is the severity of work. The severity of labor is a characteristic of the labor process that reflects the load on the musculoskeletal system and functional system that supports their activities. Labor intensity reflects the compliance of the means and conditions of human activity with its capabilities. If the severity of work is a characteristic of physical forms of work, then the intensity characterizes more of the mental load. Classification of working conditions according to the degree of intensity is based on the examination of the labor process, a result of labor, physiological, psychophysiological, indicators of the dynamics of health and fatigue, reflecting to some extent the body's response to workload. The source documents for the criteria for the severity of physical labor are the sanitary norms and rules. According to these documents, the classification of labor severity is made by energy consumption. In real production, there are situations when physical activity cannot be measured only in terms of energy consumption, and other indicators are required. The following indicators are used as indicators of the severity of the labor process: is a physical dynamic load, weight of manually lifted and moved cargo, stereotypical labor movements, static load, working posture, and the slopes of the body movement in space. Physical dynamic load is expressed in units of external mechanical work per shift. To calculate the physical dynamic load, determine the weight of the load that is moved manually in each operation, and the path of its movement in meters. Calculate the total number of operations to move the load per shift, and calculate the total mechanical work using this formula. Here N is the total number of operation, M weight of the cargo, L cargo movement path. Let's start with the weight of the cargo lifted and moved manually. Is determined by documents or is weighted on the commodity scales. The criteria for working conditions are determined taking into account the gender of the worker for one-time lifting and moving of goods. The maximum weight is taken into account. When alternating with other worker constantly during a work shift for the total mass of goods moved during each hour of the shift from the work surface or from the floor. Stereotypical labor movements. These movements refers to an elementary movement, a single movement of a body or part of a body from one position to another. Stereotypical working movements are divided into local movements, which involve no more than 1/3 of the entire muscle mass of the human body, and regional movements, where from 1/3 to 2/3 of the muscle mass function. The number of stereotyped movements can be determined by the daily production, or given that the pace of work doesn't change during the shift. Determine the number of movements for a few minutes. Calculate how many movements are performed per minute and multiply this value by the time of work, which is determined by timing. The working position. The working position is determined visually. The time spent in a certain position is determined based on chronometric measurements. The slopes of the body. The number of slopes per shift is determined either by directly counting them or by determining their number per operation and multiplying them by the number of operations per shift. The static load. The static load is determined by multiplying the static forces by their duration. In production conditions, static forces occur in the form of holding the product or tool and pressing the tool to the processed product. In the first case, the amount of static force is determined by the weight of the object being held. In the second case, it must be determined using sensors. The criteria are developed taking into account the gender of the worker and the work of one or two hands and involving the muscles of the body and legs. The next one, movement in space. Movement in space, which means the length of transitions due to the technological process during the shift horizontally or vertically, is easiest to determine using a pedometer. This device is fixed on the body of workers, determined by the total number of steps per shift. during brake speedometer to remove. It is multiplied by the step length. For men, step length in a production environment will take equal to 0.6 meters. For women, 0.5 meters, and expressing this value in kilometers. The assessment of the intensity of the labor process is based on the analysis of the structure of labor activity of employees. Taking into account the complex of production factors that create prerequisites for the occurrence of adverse, nervous, and emotional states. Factors that determine the degree of intensity of the labor process are grouped by types of loads: intellectual, sensory, emotional, monotones, and regime loads. Intellectual loads include the following qualitative indicators: the content of the work, indicating the degree of complexity of the task, from the task of decision making to complex analytical activities with soul management in complex situations, perception of signals, information, and their evaluation. According to this factor, working conditions are divided into classes depending on the degree of complexity of processing perceived signals, from perception without correction of actions to a comprehensive assessment of related parameters. The work of business managers, vehicle drivers, air traffic controllers, etc. Distribution of functions according to the degree of complexity of the task. This indicator takes into account the complexity and number of functions assigned to the employer, from processing and performing simple tasks to preliminary work on distributing tasks to other people and monitoring their performance. And the last one, the nature of the work performed. Sensory loads. Sensory loads include duration of focused observation in percents of shift time, density of signals, light, sound, and messages on average for 1 hour of operation, number of production facilities for simultaneous monitoring, size of the object of distinction for the duration of concentrated observation, working with optical devices for the duration of concentrated observation, monitoring of the video terminal screens, the load on the auditory analyzer, and load on the voice box. The next type of loads, emotional loads. These loads include the degree of responsibility for the results of their own activities, the significance of the error, the degree of risk to your own life, and the degree of responsibility for the safety of others. The monotony of loads is evaluated by the number of elements needed to implement a simple task or repeated operations. The highest tension on this indicator is typical for workers of convoy labor. The duration of simple production tasks or repetitive loads. With a decrease in this indicator, the harmfulness of working conditions increases. The criterion for optimal working conditions for this indicator is exceeding the duration of the task by 100 seconds. Time of active actions. Active actions don't include monitoring the progress of the technological process. The higher the monotony of loads, the shorter the time for performing active actions, and the longer the time for monitoring the technological process. Monotony of the production environment, which is understood as the time of passive monitoring of the technological process in percent of the shift time. This indicator actually complements the previous one. The operating mode includes three indicators: the actual length of the working day, which can be from 6 to 8 hours for the optimal class of working conditions, to more than 12 hours per day for the class of work 3.2. Shift work, which is determined on the basis of internal documents regulating the work schedule at the enterprise. The optimal class of working conditions for this indicator includes single shift work. Two shift work without a night shift is referred to the acceptable class. Three shift work with irregular shifts with work and night are referred to classes 3.1 and 3.2 respectively. Availability of regulated breaks and their duration. Insufficient duration of regulated rest breaks or their absence aggravates work stress, since there is no element of short-term protection of time from the influence of factors of the labor process and the production environment, which leads to a deterioration of the functional state of the employee. So, how the work is performed? Firstly, set the class of each indicator of the severity of the labor process. Secondly, the overall assessment of the severity of the labor process is established by the indicator assigned to the highest degree of severity. And thirdly, if there are two or more indicators of class 3.1 and 3.2, the overall rating is set one step higher. You have to do the next three tasks. For example, the first task: determine the class of working conditions based on the following indicators of the severity of the labor process. Physical dynamic load is 2100. Weight of the load lifted and moved manually, 5 kilograms. Static load, when holding the load involving the muscles of the body and legs, is 42 thousandths. Being in a standing position up to 40% of the shift time, moving in space horizontally 3 kilometers. To do this task, you can use this table. It's a table which shows working conditions by indicators of the severity of the labor process. The task is not so hard because here you can see everything what you need to solve. Then ask following control questions. Question number 1. What is the severity of labor? Question number 2. What documents define the criteria for the severity of physical labor? Question number 3. What indicators are used as indicators of the severity of the labor process? Now, question number 4. How is the class of working conditions determined? Question number 5. According to the classification of the severity of labor by energy consumption, what type of work can be attributed to precision instrumentation? Question number 6. What is physical dynamic load? Question number 7. What are stereotypical labor movements? Question number 8. What is regional work? Question number 9. What can be called moving in space? And the last question, what is used to determine movement in space? To answer these questions, you can use this recommended literature. Thank you for your time, for your listening. Good luck and goodbye.